My name is Clara. I'm 31 years old. And 3 months ago, I was standing in my kitchen making dinner when a stranger called to tell me that my husband had been found unconscious on a mountain trail in Colorado. The problem was that my husband had walked through our front door 40 minutes earlier. I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened next. I am not someone who panics easily. I grew up in a household where my mother handled every crisis with the same steady voice she used to read bedtime stories. I inherited that from her. I'm the person my friends call when they need someone to think clearly under pressure. I say this not to brag, but because what I'm about to describe is the kind of thing that would have made anyone question their own mind. And for a while, it made me question mine too. Every September, my husband takes a solo hiking trip. It started before we met something he'd done since his 20s to reset, to clear his head before the busy season at work. 7 days, no phone signal, just him and a trail map and whatever he could fit in a backpack. I used to joke that I married a man who needed to disappear once a year, and he'd always say the same thing back, that coming home to me was the whole reason the trip was worth taking. We had been married 4 years. This was the 4th trip. He left on a Sunday morning. I drove him to the trailhead outside Durango myself, watched him adjust his pack straps, kissed him goodbye at the wooden post marker near the parking lot. He looked the way he always looked at the start of that trip, lighter somehow, like he'd already started breathing different air. I told him I loved him. He told me not to eat cereal for dinner every night while he was gone. I laughed and said no promises. The following Sunday, he came home. I heard his truck in the driveway around 6 in the evening. I was at the kitchen island with my laptop, finishing a logo revision for a client. I heard the front door. I heard him drop his pack in the hallway, that heavy thud I always recognized, and then he was standing in the kitchen doorway with 7 days of trail dust still on him and a sunburn across his nose. He looked right at me and smiled. I got up and hugged him. He smelled like wood smoke and pine and dried sweat, exactly how he always smelled coming off that trail. I held on a little longer than usual, the way you do when someone's been gone a week. He hugged me back, said he was starving, asked if there was anything to eat besides cereal. I laughed and told him I'd actually cooked. He seemed surprised and pleased. We ate dinner together. He told me about the trail conditions, a section that had washed out from summer storms and forced him to reroute. He asked about my work week. He fed a piece of bread to our dog under the table when he thought I wasn't watching. Everything was ordinary. Everything was exactly as it should have been. At 8:40 that night, my phone rang. I almost didn't answer. The number wasn't saved, a Colorado area code, and I assumed it was a spam call. But something I still don't know what made me pick up. The woman on the other end identified herself as a park ranger at a station near the La Plata Mountains. She asked if I was the emergency contact for my husband and gave his full name. I said yes, confused, already looking across the living room at him, sitting on the couch with our dog. She told me that a trail maintenance crew had found a hiker matching my husband's description that afternoon, unconscious and severely dehydrated, approximately 4 miles from a backcountry campsite. He had been airlifted to a hospital in Durango. She said he was stable but had not yet regained consciousness. She said I should come as soon as possible. I stood in the kitchen doorway holding the phone, and I looked at my husband sitting on the couch. He was looking back at me now, watching my face. I told the ranger there must be a mistake. I said my husband had just come home. She read me the ID number from his trail permit. She described his pack, the color, the brand, a small repair patch on the left strap. I knew that patch. I had sewn it on myself 2 summers ago when the stitching came loose. My husband stood up slowly. "Who is it?" he asked. I couldn't speak. He walked toward me and I took 1 step back without thinking. I don't know why I did it. It was involuntary, like something in my body understood before my brain could catch up. He stopped. A flicker of something crossed his face, not concern, exactly. Something more careful than that. I told the ranger I would call her back and hung up. The man standing in my kitchen asked me again who had called. His voice was the same, his face was the same, the sunburn was the same. But in that moment, with 4 feet of kitchen tile between us, I felt something cold move through my chest that I had never felt around my husband in 4 years of marriage. I told him it was a wrong number. He watched me for a second longer than felt natural, then nodded and went back to the couch. That night, I lay in the dark, and I did not sleep. I went through every rational explanation I could find. A prank, an administrative error at the ranger station, a different hiker with a similar permit. But the permit number was right. The pack description was right. And there was something else I kept circling back to, something small that I had noticed at dinner and pushed aside without examining. When my husband cuts his food, he holds his fork in his left hand and switches it to his right to eat. He has done this his entire life. It's an old habit he picked up from his grandfather. I have watched him do it at every dinner table for 4 years. Tonight, he hadn't switched. I told myself it meant nothing. People change small habits. He was tired from the trail. I was looking for reasons to be frightened because a stranger had called and said something impossible. But I did not sleep. The next morning, I told him I needed to drive to my sister's house to help her with something. I said it casually, over coffee, watching his face. He said, okay, told me to say hi for him, kissed me on the cheek. His lips were warm. His voice was warm. Everything about him was exactly right, and I felt insane for what I was thinking. I drove 40 minutes to my sister's apartment and sat in her parking lot and called the ranger station back. The ranger confirmed everything. My husband was in the ICU at Mercy Regional in Durango. He had regained consciousness late the previous night. He was asking for me. I sat in that parking lot for a long time. Here is what I want you to understand about why I didn't call the police that morning. I know it seems obvious. I know that's what anyone watching from the outside would say to do. But I need to explain what was happening inside my head because this is the part that almost broke me. The man in my house knew everything. He knew our dog's name and our dog's specific quirks, that she only drinks from the left side of her water bowl, that she refuses to go outside in rain unless you hold an umbrella over her, that she has a toy shaped like a hedgehog that she will not let anyone touch. He knew that I take my coffee with oat milk and 1 sugar and that I hate when the cabinet above the sink is left open. He knew the name of my best friend from college. He knew that my husband and I have a running joke about a terrible road trip we took to Nashville 3 years ago. He knew the inside references, the shorthand, the texture of our daily life together. If I called the police and said there is a man in my house pretending to be my husband, what would they see when they arrived? A man who lived there, whose name was on the mortgage, who knew every detail of our home, and a wife who was, apparently, claiming her husband was simultaneously in a hospital 4 states away. I was afraid of being the one who seemed unstable. I was afraid of tipping him off before I had proof. And underneath both of those fears was a darker one that I am only now able to name. I was afraid of what someone capable of this was also capable of doing if he realized I knew. I drove back home. I smiled when I walked in the door. I asked if he wanted lunch. The following 3 days were the strangest of my life. I watched him constantly, cataloging everything. The fork switching habit never came back. He always cut and ate with the fork in the same hand. He flinched once when I called our dog by the nickname only my husband and I used, a private silly name that isn't worth explaining, but the flinch was there. Just a half-second of recalibration before he recovered. He knew almost everything. But almost was the margin I kept measuring. On the second night, I told him I wanted to watch the video from our wedding reception, that I'd been feeling nostalgic. He agreed easily. We sat on the couch and I watched his face while our wedding played on the TV. I was looking for the moment near the end, the one where my husband's college roommate gives a speech that makes my husband cry. I have watched that moment 100 times. My husband always gets quiet right before the punchline, like he's bracing for it. The man next to me laughed at the punchline. He didn't get quiet first. And then I saw something that made my blood go cold. In the reception video, there was a brief moment where my husband and his college roommate were standing together near the bar, laughing. The camera caught them side by side for about 4 seconds. I had never noticed before because I had never had reason to look. But standing side by side like that, the resemblance was remarkable. Same height, same build, same jawline. My husband's roommate, someone who had been a guest at our wedding, someone who had been to our house for dinner, someone I had cooked for and laughed with, looked enough like my husband to be his brother. I paused the video. The man next to me said nothing. I said I was tired and went to bed. That night, in the bathroom with the door locked and the shower running to cover the sound, I called my sister and told her everything. I made her promise not to come over, not to call the house, not to do anything yet. She cried. I told her to stop crying and listen. I needed her to help me research, quietly, without leaving any trace. What she found over the next 48 hours changed everything I thought I understood. My husband's college roommate had worked in theater for several years after college, specifically in prosthetics and makeup design for a regional theater company. He had left that career 5 years ago, but the training was there. More importantly, my sister found something else. Records from a cosmetic surgery clinic in Phoenix, paid in cash 18 months earlier. A series of procedures. The kind that don't announce themselves loudly, not dramatic reconstruction, but subtle, targeted refinements. A nose brought slightly narrower, a chin adjusted. Subtle but cumulative. She found his Instagram, dormant, for 2 years. In the most recent photos before it went quiet, he looked like someone who had spent a year making himself look like someone else. My legs gave out and I sat down on the bathroom floor. I thought about every interaction I'd had with this man over the past 3 days. Every meal. Every touch. I felt physically sick in a way that had nothing to do with surprise. It was the specific nausea of realizing that your reality was being managed by someone else without your knowledge or consent. My sister wanted to call the police immediately. I told her not yet. I knew that if we called the police and he was taken in for questioning, the first thing his lawyers would do is argue mistaken identity. My word against his. One confused wife against a man who had been living as my husband for over a week in our house, with full knowledge of our life. I needed something documented. Something indisputable. I spent the next 2 weeks acting like nothing had changed. I cooked. I watched TV. I laughed at his jokes. Every time he touched me, I kept my face completely still. I was running on something beyond adrenaline, a cold, focused fury that I had never known I was capable of. I contacted the hospital in Durango through my sister's phone and learned that my real husband had been discharged but was being monitored for what appeared to be symptoms consistent with prolonged sedative exposure. The doctor suspected he had been drugged at some point during his trip. Something slipped into his water supply at camp. He didn't know what had happened. He just knew that he'd woken up in a hospital and that his wife wasn't answering his calls. He had been calling my phone. The man in my house had been intercepting every call, every text, telling me the notifications were work emails, handing me the phone at moments when there was nothing incriminating visible. My real husband, confused and frightened in a hospital bed, had been trying to reach me for days while the person who had put him there sat next to me on our couch. I will never stop being angry about those 2 weeks my husband spent not understanding why I wasn't coming. I collected everything. I had my sister document the surgical records. I got timestamps from the ranger station. I pulled our home security footage from the cloud backup footage that showed him arriving home in my husband's truck at a time that was, I calculated, physically impossible if he had actually hiked out from the trailhead. I found messages on a secondary email account, buried in a folder he clearly didn't know I could access because he didn't know that my husband had once shown me his backup password. The messages were between him and the cosmetic surgeon's office. They went back 2 years. And there was one more thing. In those messages, there were references to me. Not to my husband's money or my husband's job. To me. My work, my schedule, specific things I had said at dinner parties. Observations written in a tone that made my skin crawl because I recognized it. It was the tone of someone cataloging something they believed belonged to them. My sister found older records. A wellness evaluation he had been required to complete at his last job before he was let go. The evaluating psychologist had flagged concerns about fixation and boundary recognition. He had been recommended for follow-up care that he never completed. I thought about every time he had been in our home. Every dinner. Every holiday gathering. The way he had stood a little too close sometimes, and I had always chalked it up to his personality. On a Thursday morning, I told him I needed to go to our bank to sign some updated joint account paperwork. I said our financial advisor had called, and it needed to be done before the end of the quarter. He didn't question it. Why would he? He had spent 2 years preparing to be someone who wouldn't question things like that. The conference room at the bank had 4 people in it when we arrived. Our actual financial advisor, 2 people I had introduced as colleagues, and a notary. He sat down next to me with the easy confidence of someone who believed he was minutes away from completing something. The financial advisor placed the documents on the table. I picked up the pen. I looked at him. I put the pen back down. I said I wanted to clarify one thing before we signed. I asked him, in front of everyone, to tell me what I had whispered to him on our wedding night, right before we fell asleep. Just a small thing, I told him. Something only we would know. It was a test he couldn't have prepared for, because it was something I made up on the spot. There was no right answer. Any answer he gave would be wrong. He looked at me for a long moment. And in that moment, the performance slipped. Just slightly. Just enough. The warmth drained out of his face, and something else was there underneath it, something I couldn't name but immediately recognized as the truest thing I had ever seen on that face. The door behind him opened. 3 police officers walked in. He stood up. He started to speak. One of the officers put a hand on his shoulder and told him to sit back down. I stood up instead and walked out of the room. I stood in the bank lobby and stared at the carpet pattern and breathed until my hands stopped shaking. The charges took time to sort through because what he had done didn't fit neatly into existing categories. Identity fraud, certainly. Impersonation, yes. The prosecutors spent considerable time on the question of what happened to my husband on that mountain trail and whether the word attempted was sufficient for what he had planned. He had spent months positioning himself to assume control of financial accounts once certain documents were signed. My husband, still alive, was an inconvenience to that plan. The defense tried to argue that he had simply been helping his friend, that my husband had asked him to check on me, that I had been confused. Every argument required ignoring the surgical records. Every argument required ignoring the messages. Every argument required ignoring the sedative in my husband's bloodstream. The jury didn't ignore any of it. He was convicted on all counts. Attempted murder, identity fraud, financial fraud, psychological manipulation. The judge's statement at sentencing included a phrase I have thought about many times since. She said that the particular cruelty of this crime was not just what it had done to my husband's body, but what it had done to my ability to trust my own perception of reality. That the damage to a person's certainty about what is real is not a lesser harm. That it deserved a response proportionate to its severity. He will not be out of prison in my lifetime. There are things I still think about, alone, in the quiet hours. I think about the version of events where I had simply called the police that first night. Maybe everything would have resolved faster. But I also know myself well enough to know that faster is not the same as safely, and I had seen how completely he could perform the role of someone who belonged. Speed without proof might have been worse. I think about the 2 weeks my husband spent recovering in a hospital in Colorado, calling a phone that someone else was holding, trying to understand why I wasn't there. He doesn't blame me. He has said this many times, with the steadiness of someone who means it. But I carry it anyway, the way you carry things that logic can't quite reach. I think about the dinner table. How many times someone who was not my husband sat across from me and I handed him food and asked about his day. The ordinary intimacy of that, the violation of it. I think about how well I knew my husband and how that knowledge, turned against me, became the mechanism of the deception. Every detail I loved was a vulnerability. Every private thing was a door. The real answer to the question everyone eventually asks, how could you not have known right away, is this: because he had spent 2 years making sure I wouldn't. Because he had studied the person I loved and rendered him in such careful detail that the differences were designed to fall below the threshold of notice. Because I trusted my husband, and he weaponized that trust from the outside. But I did know. Eventually. In the fork. In the flinch. In the too late laugh. My husband and I still live in the same house. We took the couch out and got a different one. Small things like that. He still takes his September hiking trip, but now he checks in every 2 days from a satellite communicator, and I don't ask him to stop doing that even when the signal delays make me anxious. We compromised on a different trailhead, a different mountain. Some evenings we sit in the living room and I watch him cut his food and switch the fork to his right hand without thinking, the habit's so deep it's basically a reflex, and I feel something I don't have a word for. Not exactly relief, though it's close. More like the specific gratitude of knowing, without any doubt, exactly who is sitting across from you. That certainty, I understand now, is not something to take for granted. I took it for granted for 4 years. I will not take it for granted again.